Welcome back to Grid Drop. Today we're testing out 11 of F1's most iconic cars around F1's most iconic track, Monaco. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like or consider subscribing, and if you have any videos you want to see in the future, let me know in the comment section or in my Discord, which is linked in the description. The way I'm going to do this video is by a lap time ranking, and I'm only giving myself one lap with each car, so no practice laps. Starting with the oldest car, I'm going to give you a brief overview of how the car handles, and then let the rest of the lap play out so you can hear the amazing sounds these cars produce. That being said, let's get right into it. So first up is the 1991 McLaren MP4-13, famously driven by Ayrton Senna. This car was the last true manual to win an F1 championship, and it would be Ayrton Senna's third. Overall, this car is very difficult to drive. The biggest problem I noticed was traction. It was extremely difficult to keep the car from spinning its wheels when accelerating, which made it really sketchy out of almost every corner on the lap. The front wheels had decent traction, but it felt like the rears were made of ice. Additionally, understeer was a major issue. Although I felt good traction from the front, the rotation through medium speed corners was not there at all. Into heavy braking zones it was fine, but medium speed was quite tricky. However, this car was fun to drive. The challenge of managing traction led to a lot of short shifting and slow acceleration, which definitely hurt the overall lap time, but it made it quite fun. Even though the F1 games aren't known for realism, this car felt raw. Next up is the 1992 Williams FW18B, driven by Nigel Mansell. Mansell won the championship in this car, and even though it's only a year apart from Senna's McLaren, it felt vastly different. For starters, traction was much more smooth. I felt more comfortable putting the power down on corner exit, and the rears felt much more stable than the McLaren. However, it definitely wasn't easy. Although the traction felt much smoother and more controlled, it was much more difficult compared to modern F1 cars. As for rotation, the front end felt more planted than the McLaren, and it was very easy to just chuck the car into a corner. Once mid-corner, however, the car felt very unstable. I'm not too sure why this is, but both the fronts and the rears seemed to slide around at very low speeds. Overall, this car was easier to drive than Senna's McLaren, however it wasn't necessarily a breeze when compared to the more modern cars. It still had a raw, mechanical feeling when driving, which made it a total blast to take around Monaco. Next up is Damon Hill's 1996 Williams FW18. Hill famously won the championship in this car, racing against names like Michael Schumacher and Mika Häkkinen. This car, weirdly enough, felt extremely similar to the 1992 Williams. Although there's a 4-year gap from one to the other, there wasn't much of a difference when driving. Overall, most things improved from the 1992 car. Traction felt easier and smoother, there was a better balance of rotation through the corners, and braking felt solid. I did feel that it was easy to lock up into heavy braking zones, an issue that wasn't really present in the 1991 or the 1992 car. The car did feel a little sluggish when going through the slow corners, but it definitely had more stability than the 92 Williams. Overall, the biggest difference is that this car felt a little more technological, and I noticed a lot less raw power. This could be a result of better traction on corner exit, but overall it was really fun to drive. Next is the 1998 McLaren MP4-13, driven by Mika Häkkinen. Häkkinen won the championship this year, scoring an even 100 points and beating Michael Schumacher. When driving this car, I finally noticed some major differences to the last ones. Firstly, braking was absolutely atrocious. It felt like every corner I was about to lock up, and I had to be extremely cautious on the brakes. It was difficult to balance braking too little and locking up. The normal method of trail braking proved to be pretty ineffective, and I definitely lost time throughout the lap because I was not used to braking in this car. I felt like I had to brake earlier than normal in order to make the corner. The rest of the car felt terrible as well. Decent traction was extremely rare, and putting the power down smoothly was quite the challenge. Overall, this car brought back some of that rawness, but it was really hard to drive. If I practiced more with this car, I could definitely shave off seconds, but I would need to spend a lot of time in time trials. Next up is the 2003 Williams BMW FW25. This car did not win the championship in 2003, but Juan Pablo Montoya showcased some incredibly fine racecraft in the cockpit of this car. Overall, this car was a huge step up from the 1998 McLaren. It felt like every aspect of this car was improved, however braking was still difficult and I found myself locking up in a lot of the corners. The lockups weren't huge, but they definitely lost me some time on the lap. However, the rotation on this car felt better than any of the previous ones, and it was very easy to be confident around the higher speed corners. The front end felt more planted, and there was rarely understeer. Traction felt great as well, and I could easily slam the throttle down without worry of spinning the car or generating wheel spin. Overall, this car was probably one of the easiest ones to drive so far. Next up is the Ferrari F2004, famously driven by Michael Schumacher. This car is incredibly iconic and it helped Schumacher win his record-breaking 7th World Championship. I take back what I said about the 2003 Williams, this car is definitely the easiest to drive. Putting the power down was incredibly simple and I rarely felt uncomfortable exiting the corners. Everything about it felt natural, and even though there was definitely an element of raw power, the car performed exactly the way I wanted it to. This time around, to mitigate the braking issues, I adjusted the brake balance around the lap. Into heavy braking zones, I moved it up to 60%, and in the softer braking zones, I moved it down to 52 or 54%. This dramatically helped around the lap, and it made it much easier. Overall, the F2004 is incredibly simple and easy to drive, and anyone with track knowledge can just hop in and start putting in some pretty good lap times. Next up is the 2006 Renault R26. This car was put to the test this year against some great competition, but in the end it helped Fernando Alonso win his second world championship. Similar to the F2004, the R26 was incredibly easy to drive. Utilizing the same brake balance adjustments as last lap, this car was very good to handle under braking. Power output was smooth, braking was precise, and the rotation through the corners was incredible. Again, similar to the F2004, anyone with knowledge of a track could jump in this and produce good lap times. The R26 felt very standard, and it seemed like you could produce confident lap times around any track without really touching the car setup. This car really stuck to the track, and as a result it did everything I asked of it. Overall, the Renault R26 was very good, a very well-balanced car to drive around Monaco, and I was extremely confident during every second of this lap. Next is the Ferrari F2007, a car that helped Kimi Räikkönen achieve his world championship. This car is the last championship-winning Ferrari to date. Overall, the F2007 felt a little different to the last two cars. I don't really know how to explain it, but it felt bigger and more clunky, while also feeling more nimble. Into the heavier braking zones, the car felt noticeably different, even when changing the brake balance from corner to corner. It felt like the car had more stopping power because it really needed it. So no performance was really lost in that aspect, it just felt different. However, it also felt much more light through the corners, and was much more planted to the track than any other car so far. As a result, rotation through the corners was easily the best of any of the other cars, and it led to some major confidence in the high-speed sections. Overall, the F2007 might not necessarily be the easiest to drive so far, but it probably is the best, if that makes any sense. Next up is the 2008 McLaren MP4-23. This car helped a young Lewis Hamilton win his first ever championship by overtaking Timo Glock on the final lap of the race. This car felt a little different than the F2007. Although they're only 1 year apart, I felt like there had been some big changes. For starters, it felt a little easier to lock up. I'm not too sure what exactly was the cause of this feeling, but into the heavier braking zones I could start to feel the brakes just let go. It was a little more understeery in some parts of the track, but in others it was completely planted. The traction turned out to be a little bit more difficult to manage than the F2007, and there were a few close calls with major wheel spin. Fortunately, the difference wasn't too drastic and I was able to keep it out of the walls. Overall, the McLaren was a little more unpredictable than the last cars, but still pretty easy to drive. Now we have the incredibly famous 2009 Brawn GP BGP-001. If you don't know the story with Brawn GP, you're missing out. This is easily one of F1's most iconic cars to date, and it helped Jenson Button win his world title. Overall, this car was a little bit more inconsistent than the others, but not really. In the slower sections of the track, I felt extremely sluggish, and the car felt a little understeered. However, in the higher speed sections of the track, I felt incredibly quick through the corners, and I was very confident throwing the car into a turn. I definitely expected a little bit more performance uptick from the 2008 McLaren, so I was a little bit disappointed to experience some difficulties with this car. That being said, it did have a more technological feeling than past cars, so it took a big step towards the similarities of modern F1 cars. Overall, the Brawn GP car was pretty easy to drive, and I felt really confident around the lap. Lastly, we have the incredibly famous RedBull RB6. This car helped Sebastian Vettel win the first of his 4 titles and began Red Bull's stint of dominance for the next coming years. Obviously, the RB6 is closest to any of the modern F1 cars I've driven in the current F1 games, so that means it's physically much bigger, and you can really tell when driving it. This car feels much longer and wider than the last ones, and it feels like there's more weight to it. However, it also feels incredibly solid, and it grips the track insanely well. So far, the RB6 had the best balance of downforce on any car, and along with this, the traction felt pretty smooth, and braking was a total breeze. Although this car is the more technologically advanced of any of the cars on this list, it felt super easy to drive and very straightforward. Granted, this might be because of how closely related it is to the modern F1 cars, but it was pretty easy to drive nonetheless. So that's going to do it for this one. You can see all of the rankings by lap time right here. Let me know if you want to see more classic F1 cars on the channel in the future, and if so, what would you like to see? So if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.